Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Me. This is my channel. I hate rock music. And there's a few people haven't figured out that I'm using irony because I love rock music. And so it's an attempt at humor. But anyway, I thought I'd do a video about how grunge happened in Seattle. And there still seems to be some mystery as to why Seattle ended up creating this particular sound that's associated with the city now. And for somebody like me who's lived in Seattle for many years and watching the development of the local scene, it's pretty explicable to me, but it's still a fascinating thing to discuss why exactly grunge happened here. It makes total sense to me. And so I was born here, but my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. So I got exposed to a lot of different cultures and then moved back to Seattle to go to college in 1976. And when I got here, there was a lot of classic rock bands like Bighorn and bands like that. And so classic rock was still here. We had a legacy. Seattle claimed Jimi Hendrix as their own. And then the Sonics and the Wailers were big local bands here and established kind of a punk rock, garage rock sound of their own in the mid 60s. And so by the time I got here in 1976, by 1977 and 78, I started going out and checking out a bunch of the local bands. A lot of them were pretty primitive, but very musical. And a lot of them were interested by the Velvet Underground and the Sonics and the Wailers and had their roots kind of in some basic classic rock. But a lot of classics like Do You Love Me and songs that were part of the garage rock scene were really embraced by bands here in Seattle. And then what became kind of new wave, there was definitely some elements of what became new wave. And so some of the earliest bands I saw, as I pointed out, were pretty primitive. The Radios, the Fish Sticks, the Mice, Little Magnets. They all had definitely pop elements to them. There wasn't really a punk scene, although there was some punk bands like the Telepaths, and the Telepaths had influences from what I could tell anyway, from everything from Blue Oyster Cult to the Stooges, and were really trying to be outrageous, and they were. And then a Seattle band called the Mentors that a lot of metalheads know developed here in Seattle, and they were a kind of a primitive metal band infused with some punk elements to them, and they were outrageous. They ended up moving to LA pretty quick because most of the bands here in Seattle kind of realized that we were completely insulated. A lot of the big bands skipped even touring here a lot of times, and so we had a very insular scene. And you could kind of become a local star in some respects if you're playing original music, but everyone realized if you really wanted to get anywhere, you kind of had to move out of town. And then we had a glam rock band here called the Whiz Kids, and then there was a kind of a new wave punk band called the Screamers, who also ended up moving from Seattle down to San Francisco. And then by the 78, 79, 80, some up and coming punk bands were out there. One of them was the Cheaters, Kurt Bloch's band. He eventually formed the Fastbacks. But the Cheaters were very influenced by Blue Oyster Cult and did a couple of Blue Oyster Cult covers. And so that germ of classic rock was always here in Seattle. And even the Fastbacks, they were a punk band, but they were definitely influenced by Blue Oyster Cult and Cheap Trick. And they used to do covers of The Sweet and AC/DC. And a lot of punk audiences had trouble with them even doing those songs, even though they played them really fast and loud, and it really blended in with their sets. But there was a lot of punk audiences that really wanted sort of a purity. And so then we had bands like the Blackouts, who were completely outside of the punk thing, but were incorporated in the punk scene. But they were influenced by a lot of classic rock elements as well, including Roxy music and things like that. And so by the time the early 80s rolled around, then punk rock really hit Seattle. And then, bands that people are familiar with now, like the U-Men and the Silly Killers and the Living, they were playing a lot of punk rock. But that said, they still had a germ of classic rock in there. Tom Price of the U-Men was into a lot of surf music and garage rock and things like that. And so that was part of their brew. And the Living with Teenage Duff McKagan, a band I managed, they were really influenced by Generation X and Clash and Bad Brains, and they had a lot of versatility in their material. They did a lot of quick, fast, loud punk tunes because they got influenced by Bad Brains at one point. But they also had a lot of classic rock elements. They even did a cover of Bowie's "Cracked Actor," and so that germ was always in there. And then we had a lot of hardcore bands here as well, as like YBGB and the like, and the Farts. They were pure punk bands. There definitely wasn't a whole lot of classic rock elements to them. But I looked at other scenes like Chicago. They were really into really twisted aggro rock and math rock and things like that. And then the stuff coming out of California, like Crime and the Germs and the Weirdos. And then you had the DC scene with bands like Minor Threat. Those were pure punk bands. Although there was a band out of DC called Scream that had Dave Grohl in it, that used to do classic rock covers like Captain Beyond's "I Can't Feel Nothing." But in Seattle, um, it's just a culture of people hanging out in coffee shops, people sitting in their basement smoking pot and listening to Grand Funk and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. And so when punk came along, everybody here just embraced it because it was just more loud, great loud rock. And just because it was a lot faster and a lot shorter didn't mean that a lot of people here that just love classic rock didn't embrace it. To everybody here, including myself, it was just more rock music that was cool. And so, everybody did embrace the brevity of punk rock and the energy of punk rock because we all love that. But we still loved our Neil Young. We still loved our Led Zeppelin. We still loved even our Jethro Tull. And so for people here in Seattle, there really wasn't much different between classic rock and punk rock. It's just another phase where in a lot of other cities, there was a certain purity to it, and they really went out of their way to reject classic rock because punk rock was a rebellion against classic rock. But here in Seattle, the whole classic rock mentality never went away, and there was all these punk bands. But then bands started coming out like Green River that were really influenced by the Stooges and Blue Cheer. And so there's that, even though it's punky, there's a lot of classic rock elements that really came into their own here in Seattle rock. And then even a lot of the punk bands, by the time the early 80s and the mid 80s were going on, people here love Scratch Acid and they love Birthday Party, but they were still listening to their Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath records. And then everybody here was thrilled when bands like Meat Puppets and Black Flag came to town and started slowing down. Black Flag used to be a pretty much straightforward punk band, and then they got Henry Rollins in there and started getting dark and slow and loud. And people here love that shit and really responded to it and realized that, we don't have any problem combining punk rock and classic rock and coming up with our own thing. And my first band, for example, the first couple songs we did, one of them was the Stooges, "Give Me Some Skin," and then we did that back to back with Vandergraaf Generator, "Ship of Fools." And so it just shows that people here just really kept their classic rock roots. And it was no surprise either that we had a community here that was pretty hardcore, and they had their leather coats and their dog collars and their mohawks and their all that kind of stuff. But then a lot of these people that were going out to these punk rock shows were also classic rock fans, and they started kind of reacting to the punk crowds, which was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of us that did it. But there's a lot of people here that were just like, well, I really like the music, but I'm not really crazy about the fashion. So it was really not a surprise at all that pretty soon you had people with combat boots and flannel shirts, which were always popular out here, and start growing out their hair. And then we had a lot of bands that were actually from the suburbs that weren't as in touch with the punk movement. Nirvana came from a logging town out in the western part of Seattle called Aberdeen, and the Melvins uh, gravitated from Aberdeen to Olympia, which is a dinky little town 75 miles south of Seattle. And then we had bands coming in from Idaho and Montana moving here. A lot of them had classic rock roots. And so there was kind of a reaction to punk rock, re-embracing of classic rock elements, and that included growing your hair out and wearing jeans and t-shirts. And then it was no surprise that it eventually turned into grunge. It was just this whole mishmash of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Blue Cheer and the Stooges and Black Flag and Minor Threat and the Bad Brains and whatever else. As long as it was loud and had great guitars, nobody cared. And so everybody started doing that. And the more bands that did that, that kind of excited everybody, the more bands started moving here to do it, and more bands started emulating that. And pretty soon, by 87, 88, 89, you had 100 bands in this town that wore jeans and t-shirts and long hair and mixed Bad Brains and the Stooges and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. And we liked good rhythm sections. We liked good Robert Plant styled frontmen. No wonder Soundgarden came out of Seattle. And, they were a great combination. All the things that were great about Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and a very Robert Plantish vocalist. And yet they had this grunge thing going. So they took all that punk energy and the distortion and added the classic rock elements and complex arrangements and guitar solos. And think of all the punk bands that really didn't really have a lot of guitar solos. And everybody in Seattle always loved ripping guitar solos. And so it just became a thing here in Seattle. And so for me, like I say, it gets to the point where it rained a lot. People hung out in their basements smoking weed, listening to classic rock albums and listening to Led Zeppelin. And then Sex Pistols come out and they love that. And then sooner or later, they come crawling out of their basements, after drinking a bunch of beer and smoking a bunch of weed and loud guitars and guitar solos and general craziness just seemed to be the thing. And it just makes total sense to me. And then the whole idea of the hair tossing and everything else that came along with it, it was just a celebration of this new thing. People had a lot of hair. Of course, they're going to toss it around. They want to jump around with their guitars because a lot of punk bands and even some of the best classic rock bands, there's a lot of posing and jumping around and everything. So it just makes total sense. And of course, here in Seattle, grunge, the Melvins came out as early as '83, and my band, Chubby Children, was doing a lot of classic rock-oriented psychedelia and funk and everything else mixed in with it. And so it blossomed. Everybody just was reveling in it. And so, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, all through those years, grunge thrived, and more people kept getting into it. Better and better musicians, and better singers, and better writers, and a lot of bands were having a lot of successes. And pretty soon there was a big limelight in Seattle, and you didn't have to move somewhere else to make it, as it were. And thriving local record labels, Sub Pop, of course, was a big deal. That was just a couple local guys that grew up in Seattle with in the Washington State area, and loved all the classic rock. And then when punk came along, they loved that. And most of the stuff we used to love, the stuff coming out of England, the Buzzcocks and Clash and the Sex Pistols and Wire and all that shit. And then of course post-punk happened in the UK, and it filtered its way over here to the U.S. and everybody here in Seattle loved all those post-punk bands too. The Birthday Party had a big effect on a lot of bands in Seattle. So anyway, I just thought I'd do a video on that from somebody that lived in Seattle all that time and watched the evolution from very primitive pop-oriented punk bands to actual punk bands. Some of the biggest so-called punk bands around the time of 79, 80 were the Moberlys and the Heats and the Cowboys, and they were all basically just classic rock bands with short hair, funny haircuts, and shorter songs. And so anyway, the whole transition from punk to grunge, it just seemed like a natural evolution here. And the bottom line here for me, I guess, is everybody here just always loved classic rock. And when punk rock came along, it was just more classic rock. And of course, looking back now, punk does seem like just more classic rock. And looking back at grunge now, it just seems more like classic rock. So that whole evolution is no shocker to people that lived here. So for all you outsiders, I thought I'd do a video about that. And there you have it. Grunge is a Seattle thing, and it's completely understandable. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.